Cool. All right. Now, everybody has a line gauge, and I want you to go ahead and I want you to get out this handout, the Quick Brown Fox. You can set your line gauge off to the side for a moment. We're going to come back and we're going to use this in just a second. So, let's talk about the Quick Brown Fox. Now, you'll notice on this handout, it's 4 words. Some of the letters are in red. I'll explain why in just a minute. But also notice that there is a series of horizontal lines. Now, if you recall back to assignment 14, parts of a character. Does everybody remember reading that PDF? If you read the PDF. In that, there were several different definitions that PDF covered. Some of those we're going to be talking about today. Now, I'm not going to necessarily talk about things, for instance, like the bowls that you would find in like the lowercase q or the lowercase b. Or the O's. I'm not going to be talking about things like the I and the E. That's not the type of anatomy that I'm really interested in today. What I really want to point out is that when we are talking about type, we need to understand how to measure type. We need to understand how type is actually created. Not necessarily about the individual letter forms itself, but what actually makes up type. How do we actually set type? So the first thing that I want to point out is that in each one of these lines, you've got these little letters. Does everybody see these? Okay, in fact, let me zoom in here. Let's see if it'll focus. Focus, focus, focus. Here we go. All right, take a look at line A. Does anybody know what that is called? Baseline. Baseline, absolutely. Okay, so that is the baseline. How would you define the baseline?
The letters stand on?
Yeah, so it is basically the line in which the letters sit on, right? Now, notice not every part of a character sits on the baseline, right? Or at least the bottom part of the character. Notice the lowercase q. The bottom of the lowercase q touches line B. First off, remember in the anatomy, the parts of a character, what do we call this part of that lowercase q? Yeah, the descender, right? Why? Because it descends below the baseline. Now, where the descender actually comes to rest is another line. What do we call this line? Does anybody know?
The descending line?
It's a good guess. It is based on the fact that it is measuring the descender. It's actually called the descent line. We're shortening it up a little bit. So that's the descent line. So line A is your baseline. Line B is your descent line. So everybody see that right there? Okay. Now, let's move over here and let's look at the lowercase b. In the case of the lowercase b, it does sit on the baseline, which is great. But notice that there is a part of the b that actually extends up and comes to this line here, which I happen to actually note with the letter C. And you'll notice the lowercase f also rests, as well as the lowercase h in the word the. So, what do we call this part of the lowercase b or this part of the lowercase f? The ascender. Okay, so it's the opposite of a descender. This is an ascender. So if a descender comes down to the descent line, what do you think line C, where the ascender comes up to, is called? Ascender line. Good, another good guess. Shorten it, ascent line. So we have the ascent line, the descent line, the baseline. Next, let's come over here and let's take a look at the lowercase x. The lowercase x comes up to this line. From the baseline, to this line here, which, let me scroll back over here. I actually gave the letter D. So if I come back over, let's look at the X. What do we call this line here? Or better yet, if you remember in the parts of the characters, anybody remember what this measurement is called with the lowercase x? X height. It was actually mentioned that in the actual document. So this is the X height. Now there are a couple other names for this. Number one, this could also be called the torso. And this line, while this is a line for X height, could also be called the midline. Okay, a couple different terms. Typically we call it X height. Okay. However, I have heard it called torso and midline. Okay. Now, questions about this so far? All right. So let's come all the way back to the beginning of this sentence. So we've talked about every single line except for line E. Now, line E in this is the dashed red line. Does everybody see that? Does everybody notice that that line is slightly lower than the ascent line? The ascent line in this case is gray, and this new line that we're talking about, the dashed one, is slightly below that. Does everybody see that? It happens to be, if we look at the uppercase T, the uppercase T sits on my baseline and comes up, not to the ascent line, notice where the lowercase h comes up to. The lowercase t comes up to this dash line. So it just falls just short of the ascent line. Does everybody see that? Okay. Does anybody know what that measurement is called? What that line is called? Let me see if I can give you a hint. When we were talking about the lowercase x, the measurement from the baseline to the line, the top of the line of the lowercase x, is called the x height. This measurement is measuring a capital letter. So what would we call this height? Any guesses?
Cap height.
Cap height. Absolutely. This line E measures what we call the cap height. That's the cap height. Everyone with me so far? Okay. So, a couple of things about this. Now that we kind of have all of these terms defined here. So we have the descent line, we have the ascent line, we have the baseline, we have the x height or midline or torso, and then we also have the cap height. Okay. These are your basic layout lines for any sort of font. So when you were watching the movie Helvetica, the documentary Helvetica, and they were talking to all of these designers, these type designers, and you saw in some of the computers that they were kind of manipulating character forms and they were kind of creating stuff. You may have caught a glimpse of, on their screen, these lines actually showed up. Okay? This is kind of, think of it from a standpoint of like grid-based design. This is the grid for all of our type. Okay? These are the important lines that every single font is designed around. Now, not every font, though, follows these rules. For instance, there are some fonts in where the capital letter, the cap height, is the same as the ascent line. There are some where the ascent line goes way above the actual font itself, or the descent line comes way down. For instance, does anybody use the font Zapfino on a Windows machine? No? They have these ridiculously long, sweeping, ascent and descenders. So they may have something like a lowercase f that does stuff like this. Where you may have a baseline that's like right here, and the F actually has a descender as well as an ascender. It's like these ridiculously sweeping, scrolling kind of fonts. Suffice to say, this is what you need to understand. Not every font right, is going to use the same ascent line, descent line, X height, cap height. Okay? There are going to be differences. But every font will have an ascent line, a descent line, a baseline, an X height, and a cap height. Does that make sense? They all have it, but they're not all going to be the same. Now, the important thing about this is that these lines give us the basis by which we can actually measure type. And what do I mean by measure type? Well, if I've got a, see if I can find, I didn't even grab my own. Hold on. Here we go. Take a look at this page here. This one. Oh, let me go back. There we go. Okay. Notice I got some type here at the top. I have a paragraph of text right here. I even have some more text down here at the bottom. So everybody recognize these different elements. What if I didn't know what size font this was? What if I was handed this and said, hey, I need you to recreate this copy, right? And I can zoom in here. If I can get the zoom working correctly. Come on, there we go. If I was given this type, how would I measure this, right? How would I go about measuring this particular type? How would I know what's the font size? How would I know what are the different things that make up this layout? Okay? So we need to understand a little bit more about these lines here and how they actually help us measure fonts. The first thing that we need to talk about is measuring font size, the size of your font. Now, a lot of people think that you can measure font on your line gauge accurately using this scale here. Does everybody have something like this on your line gauge? We have these giant uppercase E's. Does everybody see this? All right, this is your E scale. Now, it's true. See my uppercase T? If I were to grab my E scale and try to find one that actually matches, I'm going to get close. So in this case, which E do you think is close? So notice you can see the measurements here in the corner. So like for instance, let's talk about 100. Do you think that that uppercase T and this one matches? No. All right. How about this one? We're close, not quite there yet. How about this one? Is that one pretty good? Okay, but what about this one? Nope, too small. So it might be 72. It might be slightly smaller. Who knows? Now, I do know because I actually wrote on here. It's actually Minion Pro 72 point, but that's beside the point. This E scale right here, if you've got a capital letter or you've got only all caps, this is a really good way to kind of get you either in the ballpark or, depending on the actual font itself, may actually give you the actual font size. Okay, but that is if your font is following kind of these traditional lines. Okay, if you have a crazy font that actually has, you know, different cap heights and baselines and things like that, it may not actually work. So let me explain the more accurate way of measuring a font. Now, this requires you to know two things. Okay. The first thing you need to know is the font that you're measuring needs to have a descender and an ascender. A descender and an ascender. Ray, what's up?
Want to fix them?
If you can, that'd be great.
Get under there.
All right. Yes, just roaming around fixing things. I love it. You need an ascender and a descender. So, in the case of the Quick Brown Fox, do we have an ascender and a descender? Yeah. In fact, if we look at the word quick, right, we have a descender in the lowercase q and an ascender in the lowercase k. Do you agree? Okay. Now, in this particular example, kind of cheating a little bit because I already have the ascent line and the descent line visible. But what if, going back to that other handout with that paragraph of text, what if you don't have visible ascent and descent lines? What can you do? Remember, you have a ruler. Thoughts? Suggestions? What can you do?
Make them yourself.
Yeah, you can make them yourself. Can you make an ascent and a descent line using the ruler? How? How would you do that?
Lining it up.
I know, this sounds simple, but come on, just work with me here. I know it's a Monday morning. Yeah, so you can take your ruler, you can take the straight edge of your ruler, right? And you can find a line where you have some ascenders. You can put your line gauge on that, your ruler, and you can actually make the horizontal line yourself, right? And then you can do the same thing with the descent line on the same line. Then would you actually have your ascent and descent lines? Yes, you can do that, okay? Now, how's it going?
No luck.
Well, these turned off, so they may need to be turned back on again. So for instance, let me go back to this. And here I have my ruler, right? It doesn't really matter what size you're using, what side you're using, I should say. So let me find, let's see, what's a good line here that I can use? Probably the second line here, right? So I have the H in mechanism, right? And then the P in printing press. So if I line up the two P's in printing and press, and I can actually create a line here, can't I? Okay. Notice how I'm extending that line out here so I can actually measure from that line to the top of the H. And then from there, I can then take my line gauge and I can actually measure from the top of the H to that line to actually get a measurement. Okay? Does that make sense? So really quickly, I just created a descent line over to where there's an ascender, in this case an H. That way I can measure from the top of the H to the descent line, and that will actually give me the font size. So to measure a font, any font, on any page, in any layout, the measurement is from the ascent line to the descent line. That is going to be your font size. So from the ascent line to the descent line. Okay? Which means if you're able to identify the font and you've got a line gauge, you now know exactly what font size and how to actually lay out that type. Agreed? Now, there is another measurement that is very, very important when you were talking about typesetting. So again, coming back to this page here. Focus, focus, focus. Anytime now, come on. There we go. All right. Does everybody see that each of these lines of text, there's some space in between the lines of text, right? They're not on top of each other. Does everybody see that? More importantly, look right here where I have the descender in the P and the ascender in the F and the L. Let me see if I can zoom in even more. Here we go. Okay. Does everybody see the little bit of white space between the descender in the P and the ascender in the F and the L? Does everyone see that? They're not touching, right? There is some space there. So there is actually space that's added between the lines of my text. Does anybody know what that's called? What is it? Leading. Okay? Leading. Why is it called leading? Anybody know? It goes back to this era. This is movable type. Metal type. Remember at the very beginning of Helvetica, he was rummaging through a drawer that kind of looked like this and kind of put together the word Helvetica in these little metal letters. Remember this? This is how printing was done back in ye olden days. Okay? Each one of these letters was made from lead. This was not exactly a safe job to have, handling lead all day long. But it was soft enough of a material that and it could hold ink well, when you actually press paper into it, it allowed for a really good imprint of that letter on a piece of paper. In other words, it was an ideal metal to use for printing. So each one of these itty bitty little letters in your font is called a sort. So if you look at this particular image, I'll zoom in here. It's obviously in, if you look right here, look, the quick brown fox. Look at that. That's interesting. Notice how it's backwards? Okay. Remember how we did your name backwards when we laser cut it? Which, by the way, we'll be inking those up and doing that next week. So if you read this upside down and backwards, the quick brown fox jumps over the lazy, and then we can kind of keep going. Lazy dog is the beginning of the next line. Now notice how in this particular instance, the letters are kind of, the individual sorts of kind of touching each other, right? Vertically, each line is touching each other. When that happens, when there is no space between the letter forms, it's what we call set solid. Okay, so the individual lines, when they don't have any space between them, it's called being set solid. In fact, you can kind of see in this example over here, see the lowercase y and the uppercase h, how the descender and the ascender are touching each other? Does everybody see that? Okay, so there's no space between the lines. Now, how did they create space? Well, they created space by putting thin sheets of lead between the lines. By adding lead between the lines, you are adding leading. That's where the word comes from. Does that make sense? We still use that today. Now, that's how we did it in the olden days. So when they were measuring leading, what they were basically saying is that if I had a font size of, say, 12 points, they would run over to a giant cabinet that would have, whatever font they're using, Helvetica, and they would open up the drawer of Helvetica 12 points. Okay, by the way, there was an uppercase and a lowercase in this cabinet. That's where the words uppercase and lowercase come from. The uppercase had the uppercase letters, the lowercase had the lowercase letters. Everyone understand the terminology here? So everything goes back to this old day. So you would go over to your Helvetica case, and you go to your lowercase in Helvetica, and you pull out the 12-point drawer. And in the drawer, you have all these individual sorts. And you would build out your type and put strips of lead between the lines to actually create your leading. So if I was working in a 12-point font and I put 4 additional strips of lead, each strip of lead was a point thick. That's 4 additional points of lead plus my 12-point font. That's 16 total points of leading. Does everybody understand the terminology now? Okay. Now, in the case of digital type, we don't do this anymore, do we? So in digital type, if I come back here to my dot cam, how do we actually measure the leading here? I can't actually see little strips of lead. Can we agree? And to be honest with you, it's a little imprecise to sit here and try to measure between the descender and the ascender, because again, that may not be an accurate measurement, because the cap height may actually go above the ascent line in this font. Again, not everybody follows the same rules. When I say everybody, I mean fonts. Does that make sense? So how do we accurately measure this? Well, in the world of digital type, how we actually measure this, going back to our quick brown fox here, how we measure that is a measurement of baseline to baseline. So the baseline is the measurement for leading. So in the case of this text here, I'm actually going to measure from a baseline to a baseline. Okay? That is how I'm measuring my leading. Go the other way here. There we go. So I will take my ruler and I would set it at the baseline of one line and measure down to the next line. That will be my leading. Any questions about this? Now, in other areas of our industry, for instance, in web design has the same measurement, but they don't call it leading. They call it line height. Okay? Which, again, can kind of get people a little off track. The important takeaway of this is leading is a measurement from baseline to baseline. It is not a measurement of the white space between the lines. Does that make sense? Because if I measure just the white space between the line, I may get something like 2 points. Okay? Remember, the space, leading itself, is the amount of leading that you're adding plus the font size. Right? So in this case, it's not 2 points. It's going to be 2 points plus whatever the actual font size is. So you've got to measure from baseline to baseline to get this accurate. You can't just sit there and just put your ruler and try to figure out, is that 1.5 points or 2 points of space between the lines? Don't ever measure between the lines. Baseline to baseline only. Questions about this? How are we feeling about this so far? We good? All right. Now, let's talk about your line gauge. So, I'm going to use this line gauge here. Actually, because this one's broken on me. I don't know why it broke. All right, every line gauge is going to be pretty much the same. And by the way, you may hear these called type gauges. So type gauge, line gauge, same thing. We okay with that definition? All right, now, on your line gauge, you're usually going to have at least 3 different measurements. Probably 4. You should have inches, or if you have a European line gauge, you may have millimeters and centimeters. Okay, but you should have inches. Okay, you should have a scale called picas, and somewhere on your line gauge, for instance, on this one here, this clear one, has something called a computer point scale. On my big one, my point scale is actually along the entire length of this. So I actually have, where this one only goes up to 144, this one goes like all the way out to, and I've got this up against the wall, I don't know what that is, 1,296 points, right? So it really just depends on your individual line gauge. Now here's the important thing. Does everybody see the scale? Points are going to be your smallest unit of measurement. Agreed? We kind of talked about this before. Then, after points, picas are going to be your next smallest, right? And then finally, inches is going to be your largest. Okay, unless we're doing something like, say, billboards, then we may measure in feet. We okay with this? We talked about this a little bit. Now, let's talk about the relationship of these 3 measurements because it's going to be very, very important. First off, points. Points are your smallest scale. Now, it's interesting to note this line gauge actually does a really good job because it actually says computer point scale. Does everybody see that? Okay. Points, back in the old days when they were actually doing movable type and they were doing lead typesetting, a point, an actual measurement of a point back then, is different than what the computer uses as a point today. The company that changed that was Adobe. When Adobe came up with digital tools for us to use, going all the way back in the 1900s, okay, back in the day when they actually released their first digital publishing, one of the things that they were trying to do was, how do you relate these physical measurements that we use in printing to a digital machine? What they found out is that the point was close to, but not exactly 72 points for an inch. It was close, but it was off. Okay, so you got to remember, these measurements that we used in movable type days, and we were trying to figure out font sizes, were kind of approximations. Like you were eyeballing these particular measurements for a long period of time when you were designing type. So over a period of time, what actually became the standard point didn't quite fit neatly and nicely into the imperial measurement system that everybody uses here, which are inches. So here's what Adobe did. Adobe said, you know what? Forget it. What we're going to do is that we're going to say that when we have a point scale, 72 points is 1 inch. That's what they said. 72 points is an inch. So in our list of measurements here, 1 inch is equal to 72 points, right? That's what they said. Now, in this case, this is a digital point. It's a digital point. If you were to go to like Williamsburg, where they have, ye old colonial town kind of set up, and you go to the print shop there, and they're still grabbing movable type and lead, and you are trying to reproduce something that you've created digitally, something like this, and you start grabbing all of the fonts to try to actually make this work, it's not going to line up exactly the same, even if you know exactly what font size this happens to be. Why? Because that lead type is not going to be exactly the same as these digital points. Is everyone okay with that? Okay, now, it's not a big deal these days because most people generally do not do old school movable lead type. But you do need to understand that 1 inch is 72 points. Okay? That's how we measure this. Now, the other scale that we use are picas. So these picas here. Everybody see that? Now, if you'll notice, it's really kind of nice because I have the inches up top and I have the picas underneath. If you look at the 1 inch mark here, which line does that line up to in the picas underneath? If I were to draw a line connecting 1 inch down to the picas, which one do you think it connects to? 6, absolutely. Okay, 1 inch is equal to 6 picas. Do you notice how much larger the pica scale is to the point scale? Okay, so in the case of our measurements, right, 1 inch is equal to 6 picas, and notice how I am going to write this. 6P0. I'll explain the 0 in a minute. Okay, P is picas. Okay, these are points, these are picas. Does everybody see that? Okay, which means now that I know these two measurements, now I can figure out exactly how many points are in a pica, can't I? Because if there are 6 picas in an inch and 72 points in an inch, well, now I can kind of figure out how many points is 1 pica. So if I do 1 pica, how many points is that? 12. One pica is 12 points. Now, this is where I'm going to blow your mind. We are used to counting to 10. Can we agree? Okay. We divide our math into divisions of tens, right? We call that base 10 math. Picas, on the other hand, are divided into 12s. Because there are 12 points in a pica, right? Which means half a pica is how many points? If 1 pica is 12 points, what's half a pica? 6 points. Do we agree? Okay. Which means when I am trying to write 1.5 picas, here's how I'm going to write it. 1 pica, 6 points. The number to the right is points. So these are points, And these are picas. This is one, you would say this as 1 and 1/2. Whoop, if I can spell half, picas. That's what you would say. That's supposed to be an F. You got the idea. 1 and 1/2 picas. But notice, realistically, what you would really say is it's 1 pica, 6 points. Right? That's the traditional way of saying it. I'm not going to say 1.5 picas, because usually, if you're talking to somebody who's used to base 10 math, what's a half? 5, right? Or 0.5. That can mess you up, because you could be off. So the proper way of actually saying this would be 1 pica, 6 points. That's the correct way of saying it. We don't need this. 1 pica, 6 points. So this is our unit of measurement that we're actually going to use from here on out. Okay? 1 inch is 72 points. 1 inch is 6 picas. 1 pica is 12 points. Are we okay with this? Right. Now, when are we going to use these? Why would I use a pica instead of an inch? Why would I use a point instead of a pica? Here's why. Let's go back to this sheet here. I'm going to zoom out here so we can see the sheet. There we go. All right. We have some elements on this page. Agreed? Okay. Now, if I was trying to recreate this page, I'm going to need to know some measurements. Is everyone following me on this? So, the first thing I need to measure is I need to know what's my font size and what's my leading that I have in these different elements. Now, take a look at this page. First off, how many different fonts are being used? Look at the sheet I gave you. Don't look up at the screen. It's harder to see up on the screen. I'll zoom in and we'll kind of take a look at this together. How many different fonts are used on this page? Any guesses? 2. What are the 2 fonts that are, where are the 2 fonts that you are seeing here? What are the 2 different fonts? Where are they located? Okay, so the title up here, so let me zoom into the title. So here we have this font right here. Now, first off, is this a serif or a sans serif font? How do we know it's sans serif? It doesn't have the ends. I like that. That's good, right? I mean, if we're going to be really, technical about it, sans serif means, sans means without, right? Serif means those little horizontal tick marks at the bottom, right? So without serifs, basically, is what it means. This doesn't have any serifs, so therefore it's sans serif. I agree. Is anyone able to identify what this font is? Any guesses? What was it? Helvetica. Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. I had to be terrible and give you guys Helvetica. So this is Helvetica, right? You can tell that actually by the lowercase a is a really good one. And remember, all the terminals, right, are going to be very horizontal in their terminals and vertical. So that's one way of actually doing this. But is there something about this Helvetica? Is this just regular Helvetica? Yeah, it's italic or oblique, right? So this is an italic version of Helvetica. Okay, so we know this is Helvetica. What about this one down here? Same? Okay, what's the difference between these two? The what? Yeah, the font size is different, right? Everyone agree? Okay, so that's good. All right, so then down here, do we have Helvetica? Why not? How do you know? It has serifs, right? So check out the little serifs on the lowercase t and the r, right? There's more serifs there. There's serifs here. There's serifs on the k. There's serifs everywhere. So this is a serif font. Agreed? Okay. So is it as easily identifiable as Helvetica? Nah, probably not. Okay, that's fine. We can figure that out a little bit later on. What about this piece down here? Now we said 2 types of font. How do we feel about this one? First off, serif or sans serif? Serif. What's different between this serif and this serif other than the size?
Italics?
Yeah, it's in italics. Does that mean that it's necessarily a different font than this one? Or could it be the same font just in italics? Okay, so these are some observations that we're making if we're trying to recreate this page. Everyone follow me? All right, so I know that I've got Helvetica up here. It's easy to identify. I have Helvetica, but it's not regular Helvetica. It's italics. That's great. I've got 2 different font sizes. Down here at the bottom, I know I have a serif font that has yet to have been identified, and another serif font down here. The only real difference other than the size is that this is italics. So it could mean that this is the same font as this. Doesn't necessarily mean it's the same font, but we're just going to take a guess, and for right now, if I can identify this one, I'll check to see if it matches the italic version of it. Make sense? All right, so I've done that. But now that I have that, let's take a look at the rest of the page. Now, the second thing that I want to do is I want to actually measure the type, right? I want to kind of figure out, okay, what font sizes am I actually using? But before we get there, we need to talk a little bit about type measurements and the typographic scale. So go ahead and pull out this from the handouts up here. Pull this one out. Okay? Typographic scale. There's handouts up here if you guys need more. All right, and get mine out here as well. Okay, it's going to look something like this. There we go. All right. Do we have any musicians in here? No musicians? You guys just like to play the radio? Is that it? Probably not a good analogy these days. Probably nobody plays the radio anymore. Spotify? Apple Music fans? Is that it? You just, whatever app you've got, that's what you use. Now, one of the things that we'll be talking about as we start to get into page layout is this concept, and I mentioned this before, of order and structure. Okay? There's another term that we're going to use, 2 other terms, scale and rhythm. Have you heard terms like rhythm before? Where have you heard rhythm? In what? Music. Yeah, I kind of gave it away when I asked if there were musicians in here. So, when we are talking about page layout, there are a couple of things that really kind of base the foundation on how the elements on your page should be laid out. Where should they go? How much space should I give them? What sizes should I size my fonts? What should my leading be? All of these questions when you're going to do a layout are things that you're going to have to think about. Now, the number one goal of any page layout is that it's legible. Can we agree? If you can't read it, is it any good? Maybe if it's only an art piece, right? So remember back in Helvetica, right? David Carson, and he was one of the guys who was kind of big into the grunge type trend, and he was like, it doesn't necessarily have to communicate well. That doesn't mean that it's not a good layout or a design or whatever. I slightly disagree with him on that, but that's beside the point. When we are talking about how to lay out a page, how to lay out a design to communicate with somebody, okay, the rules and the structure for that goes all the way back to the very beginning of layout, back to the days of Gutenberg and his printing press. Okay, hundreds and hundreds of years. So as we begin this study of type layout and page layout, we're going to start to learn some rules. Some of those rules are going to be more like guidelines, which means you can fudge them a little bit. Some of those rules can be broken, as you saw in the Helvetica documentary. People kind of got tired of the orderliness of Helvetica and the layout and the structure that everybody was using. All the things that I'm talking about. People kind of got tired of being constrained by those things. They wanted to break out. And that's when we ended up in the 90s with crazy font layouts and everything else. And thankfully, that trend has died down a little bit. But we need to understand the order first. So, this typographic scale actually comes from this book here. The Elements of Typographic Style by Robert Bringhurst. Now, if you're taking notes, write that down. This book is not a required book for this class. However, my suggestion to you, if you want to be a graphic designer, find a copy of this book. I typically do not require this book because it goes in and out of print all the time. So depending on the year, there may not be any available prints of this particular book. So it's kind of hard to get a hold of unless you go to like a half-price books. Okay? This is quite literally kind of like the typesetting and page layout Bible of the graphic design world. Okay? This is an amazing book that has a ton of great resources in it. This book itself talks about a lot of the things that you guys went through in the parts of a character, but in far more in-depth discussion. It talks about page layout geometry. Yes, I know. I'm sorry for those of you who don't like math. There's actually geometry to page layout. Okay? This book is a fantastic book. Highly recommend it. Okay? If you want to get it. Not required, but if you want to get it. But that's where this actually comes from. So, let's talk about what this actually is. Now, if you look up at the top here, I have got, whoops, what did I just do? Nope, okay. Up at the top, I have a bunch of lowercase a's. Does everybody see that? What is the difference between all of these a's, other than spacing? Size, right? This, if you'll notice, it starts all the way down here at 6, and these are in points. 6 points, it goes all the way out to 96. Do you see that there is a visual scale going on here? That these progressively get larger. Does everybody see that? Okay. Now, also notice, while we start off 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, what's missing after 12? 13's missing, right? It goes to 14. Then 15's missing, it goes to 16. And you can see that there are certain numbers that are missing in here. This is the standard typographic scale. These sizes were typically used as kind of a visual progression in type. These were the traditional sizes that you would typically use. So, remember, back in the day, you've got metal type. You've got metal sorts. And if you remember this case that I had here, going back to this picture, look at all the little sorts that are in that case. Okay? In one of those little boxes, you have nothing but one letter. So, for instance, in this one right here, that may be, I can't really see which one it is, that may be all the S's. Okay? Does everybody see that? So you can imagine, as you're going through this case, the people who are actually making these little metal letters, right? They're made at what's called a foundry. That's why we call them type foundries today. Anybody who creates fonts digitally is called a type foundry. It's from the olden days because you had to melt down metal to make this stuff. And you did that in a foundry. As you're making these, you're not going to make type for every single point size. Agreed? There's no point, pardon the pun, in actually going through there and developing a point size of 5 points. That's too small, right? Or if you look on the topography scale, a 13 point or a 15 point or a 17 point or a 19 or a 20 point. right? There's no point in creating all of those. It just becomes more and more expensive, and it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, especially if there's, as you're looking at the scale, there's not a whole lot of variation between those individual font sizes. So as we go through this typographic scale, this is the standard typographic scale that was used. Okay, these were the sizes. Okay. Now, when you are creating a design, a page layout, there's another scale that you need to understand. Most of the things that we do to generate a well laid out design using type, we base it on our own scale. Just like in music, we have scales, right? How many people actually took a music class in elementary school? Anyone play recorder badly? You guys remember that, right? Does everybody remember the do, a deer, or female deer, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do? Does everybody remember that? Okay, those are 8 things, right? Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, 8. And that was the musical scale. There were 8 notes in the scale. Does everybody remember that? Okay, see, it was good for something. In typography, when we're actually talking about a scale from a design perspective, that's when we're talking about this bottom scale down here. Now notice, how many letters do I have here? How many font sizes, I should say? How many have I highlighted? 5. Everybody see that? Starts at 6, then it goes to 12, then 24, 48, 96. What is the pattern here? Doubles, right? This is a standard design ratio based on a font size. So, 6, 12, 24, 48, 96. This scale has 5 notes. In this case, 5 sizes. And what does that mean? Well, first off, when you are doing a design, just like this one here, okay? I have a font size here. I have a font size here. I have a font size here. And I have a font size here. Not necessarily in all cases, but in most cases when you're doing a design, the relationship, the ratio between these sizes is going to be based on the scale that you choose. That scale is based on whatever ratio you pick. In this case, this scale is doubled. Everything is doubled. I could do the scale by 1.5 times, right? So I could go 6, and then 1.5 times 6 is 9. Does that make sense? I could do that. I could do it based on tripling it every time. Right? I could start at 6 and then go to 18 and then triple it again. That would be really large. Maybe that would be good for a poster size. But every design, usually, if you're looking at a good legible size, is going to be based on this pattern. It's going to be based on a ratio of 5-note scale. Does that make sense? Okay, so first thing I want to point out, when I'm doing a design, I'm not just arbitrarily picking font sizes. I'm not going, oh yeah, I'll use 15 points here. Because that looks good, right? Looks good on my screen, I'll just use that there. I'll just use the default font size for my footer. No. You are thinking about how you are structuring and how you are laying out your elements based on an order, a scale. Does that make sense? There are 2 scales that you would typically use, the font size and the leading. The font size, again, dictates how your text elements relate to one another. The leading dictates the layout of the elements on the page. Later on, we'll talk about this by designing on a grid. Okay? And we're going to use that grid. We're going to use our leading to actually set our grid. Now, notice there's a lot of information I'm coming at you. The main takeaway in all of this is that nothing that we do in publishing is random, right? This is not like fine art where it's like, I have a little bit of red over here and a little bit of blue over here, right? You're not just coming up with things because it kind of looks okay over there. I'm just going to nudge that over there. Everything is done for a purpose and a reason. So we're going to base everything. We're going to start everything that we're doing based on font size and leading. Okay? We already talked about how to measure those things. So let's go ahead and with this page, let's discuss how we can actually measure, using our line gauge, these various elements. Okay? So first off, let's start up here at the top and let's actually measure the type in the title. Font size. How do we measure font size? It's a measurement from what line to what line? Yeah, from the ascent to the descent, or descent to the ascent, however you want to actually say it. So first off, do we have a line in this title that has both an ascent and a descent character? Yeah? Which one? Which line should we use? How about the second line? Does the second line have an ascent and a descent? No, it doesn't. It has an uppercase H, right? But there's no descenders here, so we can't use that. How about the second line? Does the second line have an ascent and a descent? Let's start off with a descender. Does it have a descender? Which one? The lowercase y. Does it have an ascender? Yeah, the lowercase f. So this would work. What about the first line? Do we have a descender? Yeah, we have a lot, right? Lowercase y, lowercase p, lowercase g, lowercase p, lowercase y. Do we have an ascender? Just the h. Now, here's the cool thing. Can we agree? This H and either the P or the Y, they're so close together. It's a lot closer than the F and the Y here, right? So I'm probably going to use my first line to actually measure that. Now again, do we see ascent and descent lines already on here? No. Like we haven't actually drawn any. Now, the nice thing about this is that because they are so close together, I probably don't need to draw them. But again, if I were doing it here, I would just take my line gauge, and of course it's helpful if you have more than one descender or ascender, because otherwise you could do something like, I'm being really egregious here. See how my ruler is canted like this, right? If I were to draw a line here, am I going to get a proper measurement from the descent to the ascent? I'm not going to be able to. So this one's going to be really hard to actually measure the font size is what I'm trying to say, with only one descender and one ascender, and they're far apart. So this one's not going to work really well. So this will work out really well because I can line up the descenders, look at how many descenders I've got. I got so many descenders. So if I needed to make the line, I can line all those up, right? I'm trying to do this while looking at the TV screen, which isn't always great. Okay, so something like that. And then I can draw that line, right? That descent line. Now, if I just measure from there to the top of the H, I can have the font size. But here's the question. Which unit of measurement should I use? Inches, picas, or points? Points. Why points? Could I measure it in inches? Would I want to? No. Yeah, typically points are used for font size because fonts, the type is usually fairly small, right? So I'm going to find points on my ruler. So I've got inches here, picas here, so I'll flip this over. There's my point scale right here. Okay, so I'm going to try to do this without jabbing myself into my... There we go. So I'm going to line this up. I'm going to zoom in here a little bit more so we can kind of see a little bit better. There we go. All right. So if I line up the top of the H to my descent line, and keep in mind the ink, the tip on this pen is going to be fairly thick, so try to do your best to line it up with the bottom. Can we see it kind of lines up with one of these lines here? This one right here? Now this scale is in twos, so that's 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, what's that? 18, okay? That's what I have on that point scale. All right, toss that over there. Let's look at this one. Let me get this one out. Here we go. Computer point scale. Again, this one's a little different. This one actually is fairly clear. So let me see, and let me double check to make sure that that is correct. So I'm going to line up the 0 down here, and this one actually goes up. So if we look at this one, right, so here's 12, 14, 16, 18. Ooh, what does this one actually say? This is like close to what? 20. Did everyone see that? That's interesting. So wait a minute. I have 20 on this scale. And on this scale, if I line it up again, this one is more like 18. But remember the thickness of my line? It's actually probably closer to 20. Do we agree? Now, a couple of things about these scales. Number one, it's hard to see this on the dot cam, but everybody can see this here. Does everybody see what happened to my little line gauge? Okay, these are plastic, yes? Which means what happens when they get hot? They warp. If your line gauge warps, how accurate is it going to be? You're going to have problems, aren't you? So, this is a warped line gauge. It's warped. It doesn't work really well. This one is fairly flat. Okay, it's not warped like this one is. See how bad that bananaed on me? Okay. So, if you have a warped line gauge, okay, your measurements may be off a point or two. That could be a problem. So be very careful about leaving these in your car in direct sunlight. Okay? Or storing them vertically like I did, and then over the summer when they didn't put any of the air conditioning on in the building, and the building got ridiculously hot over summer, it bananaed on me, which meant that it stretched. So I can't quite trust this white line gauge. This one, on the other hand, seems to be a bit more accurate. So I'm going to assume that 20 points is correct. So I'm going to say 20 points. Oops, what did I just do? There we go. Okay. So I'm going to put 20 points there. The next thing that I want to measure is the leading. Okay. Now, typically how we would write this is we'd write the font size slash and then whatever the leading is. So in this case, I have a font size of 20 points and I don't know what the leading is yet. How do I measure the leading? What's the measurement for leading? Baseline to baseline, right? Okay, so I'm going to grab my point scale here, and I'm going to start here at the bottom. I'm going to line this up with the lowercase, with the L here. So from this baseline to this baseline here, what does it measure? Let me move this over so we can kind of see the numbers. What does it look like my leading is? 24. Yeah, it's 24. Does everybody see that? So from here to here, from baseline to baseline, it looks like it's exactly 24 points. Okay? So how I'd write that down while I'm analyzing this, it's 20 points, font size, 24 point leading. That's how I'm going to notate it. So if you're ever given a sheet like this, a little worksheet or something, and somebody's just writing everything down, that's how they're going to measure things. The first number is the font size, the second number is the leading. Okay? So, that fixes things here. What about this one? Do we have a problem measuring the font size of the author's name? And if we do, what is the problem? Yeah. Remember, font size is based on the measurement of descender to ascender. But do we have, in the name here, do we have an ascender? We do in the lowercase k, but do we have a descender? We don't. This is where the E scale can come in and rescue you. Remember these E scales here? Okay, so on the E scale, I'm going to line up this E with an uppercase letter that I've got. Now, if this is all lowercase, you're going to have to guess a bit. Okay? If I don't have an ascender and a descender and I have no uppercase letters, you're going to have to try your best and try to guess where the cap height is. Okay? And try to use this E scale. So, I'm going to line up the E with the uppercase D. So, first off, it's definitely not 18 points, right? Definitely not 16. Definitely not 14. Getting closer. Definitely not 12. How about 11? Would we say that's a little over? Yeah, I'd say that's a little over. Let's try 10. I think we got it. Look at that. 10. So here's the 10E. Right over onto the D. 10 points. Agreed? All right, so I can mark that down now, can't I? 10 points. Now, what about the leading? How do I measure the leading of this? Second question, does it matter? No, it doesn't. So, doesn't really matter. Okay? Who cares? Not applicable. Why? Because it's off by itself. Okay? But, what about the space here to here? Is that important? If I was reproducing this, right? Remember, we're not just going to arbitrarily put things on a page. I need to know exactly where to put that. Agreed? So I need to measure this space here. From this baseline maybe to this baseline. That might help me if they're in the same text frame. Or maybe if I just need to kind of know, maybe if this is a different text frame, where this text frame ends and this text frame begins, right? So if I need to know some white space here. There needs to be some sort of measurement. That is where you're going to rely on your pica scale. So your pica scale here, unfortunately, this one is broken, so I'll just use this one as an example. That's where your pica scale comes into play. Picas, okay? And you could come in here and you can actually measure the space, and you could actually see, like in this case here, it looks like it's about 3 picas. So if I were to draw a line from that lowercase y, the descender, I'm kind of guessing here, it's about 3 picas. Everybody see that? To that J, it's 3 picas. Okay. So in this case, this space may be 3 picas, 0 points. Okay. That's what that spacing may actually be. So when I'm lining up these two text elements on my page, I know to space them exactly 3 picas apart. So everybody see how I'm doing these measurements? Now I could do the same thing with how far is this frame from the edge of the page, or from here to the top of the page. I could start measuring those things as well. Again, I would be using picas. Whenever you're measuring elements on the page, I use picas. If I'm measuring type, I'm using points. Okay? May have lost some of this recording. Okay. So again, elements on the page or spacing between elements using picas. So if I want to know what this is or this is, I'm using picas. If I'm looking at type, I'm using points. Questions about this? All right, next one. Let's go down to the body copy here. Body copy is nice because there are usually tons of descenders and ascenders that we can use to measure the font size. Agreed? And we got a lot of lines to actually measure our leading. So here's what I want you to do. Taking the training wheels off. Take your type gauge, And I want you to measure font size and leading of this body copy. Go ahead and go. All right. What did you get for the font size? What was it? 10. All right. So here's what class thinks. Class thinks it is 10 points for the font size. What did you get for leading? 12. Does everybody agree 12? Okay. They may get anything wildly different, like 24 and 87 or something like that. No? All right. So let's see if this is correct. So I'm going to grab my line gauge here, my type gauge, get the right size going on here. Here we go. All right. So first I'm going to do the font size. So let me use this. It's a little bit easier to see. All right. I'm going to line up. Got descenders and ascenders here. I'll line this up. Let's zoom in a bit. All right. So if I go here to the descent line here, so that's 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. So I would concur. I would agree. From the descent line to the ascent line, it's 10 points. So good job. You got that right. So now I just need to measure from baseline to get my line height. And sure enough, if I line up, this baseline here is 0. This baseline, come all the way out here, is 12. So I would agree. I would concur. This is, in fact, 10-point font, 12-point leading. Okay? I could do the same thing down here if I wanted to. But notice, this is interesting. Check this out. This is 20 points at font size and 24 points of leading. This is 10 points. This is 10 points font size, 12 points of leading. Do we see a pattern just between these fonts here? Do we see consistency and do we see a pattern? Do we see the developments of a scale? This scale is not the same as 6, 12, 24, 48, 96, right? This scale is based on what font size? Based on tens. Do you see this? So we have 20 points in our title, 10 points for our byline, and 10 points for our body copy. So 10, 20, 30. Does everybody see that? But look at our leading. Do you see there's a scale in our leading as well? The body copy is set to 12 points of lead. The title is set to 24 points. It's doubled in the scale. Okay? This is actually based on a 12-point grid, which is why the leading is set to 12 points. If I were to draw a grid, a horizontal grid, 12, 12, 12, 12, 12, 12, 12, all the way down, okay? All of these baselines would line up on the grid. I'll show you how to do that later on, not today. We'll talk about that later. Questions about this? Okay. So do you kind of see the order in which this page, by the way, I didn't lay out this page. This is not mine, okay? This is somebody else's work, but it follows the same pattern. It follows the scale. It follows the order. It follows the rules. So everybody see that? Okay? This is what I'm talking about. And I mean, let's be honest. I mean, it's a nice looking page, right? I mean, laid out nice. It looks good. This is just the first page of a book, basically. Okay? And I just took it and reproduced it for you guys just so you can kind of see what that layout actually looks like. Now, the only caveat to this is the little footnote that's down here in the bottom left. Okay? This footnote here does not follow the scale. That footnote down there is 8-point font with a 10-point leading. That doesn't quite fit in with the scale that we have up here based on 10s and 12s. Agreed? This is a good example of knowing the rules, but also knowing when to break them. These sort of incidental elements, footnotes would be an incidental element. It's not the main element, it's incidental. these sort of elements can break the rules. In fact, in Robert Bringhurst's book, you'll see a very similar layout in his pages. So you see you have your main body copy here, but then off into these areas of white space, what we call margins, you have these incidental footnotes and sometimes captions. Everybody see that? Now notice if I zoom into this one over here, do we agree that this font size and this font size is totally different? And again, if I were to draw a grid line, notice how the grid line may land on some lines, but not others. So if I draw this line over here, notice that this one's lower. So these incidental elements sometimes will be based on their own scale, but they will have a scale as well. It won't just be, well, I just need to make it smaller, so I'm just going to drop it a couple of points, right? No, again, there is rhythm and scale on these elements as well. So you will typically have two different scales when you're laying out a book like this. You'll have the main scale and then you'll have the incidental scale. Is this starting to make some sense? Okay. Next time you look at a book, okay, I hope you take note of how these things relate to one another. Like, can I draw a line all the way across the page and can the elements line up? Is there some sort of a scale between the body copy and the titles or the subheadings within a section? Do the captions and the incidental make sense? And I will tell you, unfortunately, for many of you, you've probably come across several poorly designed textbooks in your life. And a lot of the things that we're going to be talking about over the next week will make you realize that the next time you go to read a textbook and you seem like you're bored to tears, or you're rereading the same line over and over again, has that ever happened to you before? Right? It's not necessarily because the content is boring. You probably are blaming it on that. It's because it was not typeset properly, and it's losing readability and legibility. So all of these rules, again, primary focus, legibility. Questions? Questions about measuring elements on a page. And again, we can even measure things, just to point out, this space between these elements here, I can measure that, and I'll tell you that's 1 pica. Okay? It's real simple. Again, using picas. All right, now, with that being said, I ran a little long in this particular lesson, so I don't really have time to jump into InDesign and go over InDesign today. So here's what we're going to do. Your project, Pablo project, is due at the end of class on Wednesday. I'm going to change the due date for assignment 15. On Wednesday, we're going to spend 30 minutes on Wednesday going over how to lay out type in InDesign. Like I said at the beginning of today, the tools and the interface in InDesign is pretty much identical to what you're used to in Illustrator. So there's not a whole lot new that we need to learn. But I do need to teach you how the type tool or the text frame tool works in InDesign. It works slightly different than Illustrator. Similar, but slightly different. Okay? That'll take me at most 30 minutes. Once I'm done with that, I will give you assignment 15. Just turn that in Monday when we come back to class. That'll be easy. The rest of that class on Wednesday will be time for you to finish up the project for Pablo. However, because we're going to do that, I'm going to start immediately at 10:30 on Wednesday. Okay, so please be here by 10:30 on Wednesday. Any questions? No. All right, so that's it for today. Thank you very much. I know that was a long one.